Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Carlos Rubio, and today I'm going to be presenting along with my partner, Boo Coughlin. We're going to be talking about adaptive and proactive security assessment on energy delivery systems. Before I start, I just want to thank you all for saving this time to be here with us, and also I want to thank all the collaborators of ours, Josephine Lamb, Simin Sao, and our supervisors, Doctors Gail Jun and Anna Scaglione. So, just a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, I'm just going to provide a refresher on our research activity. We're talking about motivations, goals, and general summary of our approach. Second, I'm going to be talking about three different sub-projects and tools we are working on right now. First, I'm going to talk about Onto EDS, which is ontology-based repository tool. Also, I'm going to be talking about EXO, which is a framework for risk analysis, specifically tailored for EDS. And also, I'm going to talk about Boo, actually, is going to be talking about EDS Guard, which is SDN firewall application that is also tailored for EDS. At the end of the talk, we're going to be talking about prototypes, the papers we have published, and the papers we have in the making. As usual, if you guys have any questions, just let me know. We're having some audio problems. I really hope we can move along without any trouble. Okay, so let's start with a refresher. So the main motivation of our activity is to provide security assessment for EDS. Unfortunately, this gets complicated due to the nature of EDS. It's distributed, highly interconnected, and highly heterogeneous. Also, EDS has to support continuous reconfigurations due to on-demand changes. And also, the security requirements are mostly contained in documents that are multiple, that are large, that are dense, and are difficult to digest in general. All of these opens the door for subjective interpretations, non-standard implementations, and also it opens the door for breakdowns between among stakeholders. So the goal of our activity is to assess if EDS implementations meet security requirements, pretty much filling in the gap between high-level requirements and field implementations. We plan to achieve this by implementing a framework for security assessment and monitoring that has the following properties. It must be well-defined, it must be systematic and automated as much as possible, it must be practical and configurable, and it should be non-intrusive as much as possible as well. So the big idea about our approach can be seen here. We plan to gather, first of all, we want to gather the most relevant documents on security requirements and best practices for EDS. We plan to digest, we plan to analyze those documents, and we want to obtain a description of them by leveraging an ontology representation. Then, based on this ontology, we want to introduce software-based models for security monitoring and risk analysis. And finally, those models are going to be fed by data obtained directly from EDS infrastructure. We plan to actually achieve this goal by implementing this framework, this tool framework that is called EDS SAT. As you can see in this diagram, first of all, number one, we want to obtain security requirements as well as domain knowledge from experts. Then we will plan to have that knowledge into requirements and repository engine, as you can see, number two. Also, we plan to have some data processing models as well as data collection models listed in 3 and 4, and those are going to be fed by data obtained directly by EDS infrastructure, as you can see in 5. And finally, as a result of all of this, we can obtain reports, obtained from data collection, and we can also create EDS-related documentation as listed in 6 and 7. We expect our framework to encourage the analysis of security requirements. We also expect it to be able to continually monitor the security of EDS infrastructures. And as a long-term goal, we also want a tool to promote the development of objective, traceable, justifiable, and repeatable security metrics. Um, so let's start with the first of the tools we're going to be presenting today. It's called Onto EDS. And the basic idea is that, as I said before, we're going to be modeling security requirements using ontologies. So within the general diagram of EDS framework, we can see Onto EDS pretty much represents the requirements and repository engine. Our tool should represent common vulnerabilities and exposures and should help us identify interdependencies, missing and conflict information, and also once we obtain information out of it, it should support multiple dimensions and viewpoints. For instance, I should be able to retrieve information that is relevant to EDS operators, EDS vendors, and security officials. So before we start describing it, we just want to give you a glance on what we did on how we actually how we have been modeling these documents into an ontology. Uh, the whole process consisted on a sequence of steps. The very first step listed at 1 on top, consisting of development of the foundation structure. Basically means basic concepts that are related to cybersecurity and EDS. Second, we identified and collected several documents. You can see some examples in there. And then we started processing each document at a time. Number 3, we have an example in which from the text we extracted key entities. And then we categorized those entities into the ontology structure based on the basic foundation structure we have defined in the past. And then later on, number 5, we also identified relationships. And using those relationships, we integrated them into the ontology as well. We repeated this process several times for each paragraph and each document as well. So right now, our ontology comprises approximately 300 pages of documents. We have 600 entities and over 1,700 relationships. So far, we have the following documents model. We have the cybersecurity procurement language for energy valuable systems. We have the special publication 882 from NIST. We have standard for NERC. We have the NIST 7628 document. We have another standard for IEEE, and we have 2 standards from IEC. So now we're going to talk about how we extracting information from the ontology. We are utilizing these so-called projections, which is a retrieval of a subset of ontology based on certain predefined criteria. The first projection that I'm going to talk about is the goal projection, which pretty much retrieves a subset of ontology that is related to certain objectives that a given EDS system would achieve in order to obtain a state of security. For instance, a goal can be how to protect security components, system components, how to implement certain security techniques or features, how to defend a certain attack, how to identify purposes or properties of some certain documents, or in general, it can be as wide as how to protect or how to correctly implement security principle. Here in the diagram, we can see an asset firewall, and then we have some security requirements for firewall rules. We have different rules. Those are actually contained in the actual ontology, and they have been obtained from different source documents. For instance, we have first requirement is that we have a base rule which denies all access as the default rule for the whole firewall. Now, we have also came up with another projection that is called the scenario projection. And this one includes facts that describe a system that combine agent behavior and environmental context. It pretty much contains dependencies between the system and the environment. It also can be used to create a storyline of events describing system operation. And in general, this projection enables an understanding or a broad picture of different ontology elements and the relationships. Once again, we have an example with a firewall asset, and then we get to see in a scenario in which different concepts, which obviously are different from the other goal projection I just showed you before, those are different. Another interesting projection is called the domain projection. This projection pretty much describes a taxonomy that is relative to a specific topic. And this is really good when we want to support knowledge exploration, when there's some basic understanding of a certain topic. We want to know a little bit more about it. And when it is combined with the goal projection, it can help in the identification of interdependencies and missing requirements. For instance, once again, we have here a taxonomy for the firewall, and then we have different concepts that are containing a tree-like structure that are related to the firewall. And finally, I'm sorry, no, next, because we have another one, we have the view work projection, which retrieve specific responsibilities for certain agents. For instance, here for the firewall, we have two agents, supplied and acquired, and we get to see that each of them, based on the documents, they are given different responsibilities. The supplier is expected to provide a firewall and specify some exceptions that may be related to it. And the acquirer is expected to take care of the firewall as it looks natural. Finally, we have another projection we can obtain from our ontology. It's called the risk analysis projection, which combines different threats, attacks, security confirmation, and requirements that are related to a given asset. And this projection is really useful for us because we're going to be using it in the risk analysis methodology that I'm going to describe next. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to explain how can we leverage or onto EDS ontology engine for providing a risk analysis framework that is mostly based on security requirements. So we called this framework exploitation solution. As I said, it leverages onto EDS as well as other components within our EDS framework for the purposes of risk analysis and mitigation. The basic idea is that we want to elucidate metrics that we can combine into a mathematical model. So before we start, let me just define what risk means in the context of this word. So we define risk as the probability that a particular threat will exploit a particular vulnerability of a system. So in our framework, we define a risk score that it's obtained by combining the scores of different metrics and submetrics. The different scores are combined into an overall score that is used to understand or to reason about the risk of the system. We have two different kinds of metrics. We have exploitation metrics and solution metrics. And the basic idea is we want to match them against each other to match what we perceive to be bad about a system against what we perceive to be good within a given system and try to figure out how risky it is. So for each of the metrics that we can see in here, we define a score that goes from 1 to 5. Uh, our idea is that these scores can be defined either by global or local experts. By a global expert, we mean someone with the EDS community who has been working on cybersecurity, has a reputation, and is actively participating in the community, whose reputation may allow them to assess um, the score of a given metric. And the local expert is someone working in a given EDS implementation infrastructure who is in charge of managing cybersecurity at the local context and has a better understanding of how things are implemented in that given instance. Right now, our risk score is calculated for a given asset, but we are also working on calculating scores for threats, attacks, and how to combine the scores from different assets into a combined risk analysis framework or score, super score. We can analyze a whole system or subsystem. So we have different metrics. I'm going to talk about them right now. For the exploitation, um, we have three metrics and we have three other metrics for a given solution. The first metric for exploitation is impedance, and this one refers to the likelihood that an attack is performed or a given threat is exploited. Now, we also have another metric, the severity, which is a perception on the impact or damage a given threat or attack may have on a given asset. Also, we have relevance, which is a perception of how applicable or targeted to the asset a given threat or attack is. With respect to the metrics that we calculate for the solution, we have effectiveness, which is the perception on the ability of the requirement to actually deter or counteract a given threat or attack. We have relevance, which is how applicable a given requirement is to the asset that is under analysis. And finally, most importantly, we have the implementation metric, which is a perception on how effective or how well implemented a given requirement is within a given EDS system. So now I'm going to show you an example of how these metrics are related to each other and how they can be evaluated in the context of a given EDS instance. For instance, we have an attack, denial of service, and we have two assets, the master terminal unit and a remote terminal unit. And we also have one requirement that we obtain from the consequence from the source document. And this requirement is no internet connectivity for control devices. So, as we can see here, in a certain analysis, once we analyze these metrics and try to provide some scores, the severity, the impedance of denial of service can be regarded as high, and then the severity and the relevance of it against the master terminal unit may be regarded as high, and the severity and relevance of it against the remote terminal unit may be regarded as high and medium. Then for the solution, the effectiveness of the solution to counterattack denial of service can be regarded by level expert as high. It's really effective to counteract. And the relevance and implementation with respect to the master terminal unit may be regarded as high because it's really important that this may be regarded that this specific requirement is applicable targets an MTU in high level, but perhaps in the implementation it is determined that it's not willing. On the other hand, for remote terminal units, as well, the relevance may be medium because mostly the solution is not tailored for RTUs. But the implementation, once the implementation is examined, it may be determined that the implementation is really good. So it has it obtains a high score. So we combine the difference of scores for exploitation and then the subscores for a solution, and we use them to calculate the actual overall score, which is pretty much the subtraction of the exploitation score subscore from the solution subscore. The basic reasoning behind this is that if the final Excel score is greater than zero, um, we can say we're in a good shape. Risk is minimized. If we are close to zero, then well, central decisions must be made. But if the score is less than zero, then certainly we're doing something wrong. Okay, so let me give you let me describe a little bit how we're going to be calculating this Excel score. As I said before, we're going to be leveraging the risk protection from our onto ADS engine. Um, so given an asset, we're going to be retrieving all threats, attacks, requirements, and techniques that are related to it from the tool. Then we're going to match these uh, all of these together uh, to create some tuples that we call the TARS tuples. For instance, we have an example here in which we have a threat. It's called disgruntled employee. We have an attack, which is network backdoors and holes, and then we have a requirement that says shouldn't be any unnecessary ports, and we also have a security technique, which is the implementation of authorization by means of permissions. Those four are related to each other as we can obtain that information from the ontology itself. Then once we create this kind of tuples, then we calculate the exploitation and solution subscores, and then we finally calculate the Excel score for each tuple. And as a final step, we evaluate risk on the Excel scores obtained for each of these tuples. I'm going to give you an example right now. So let's say, for instance, that we want to protect a network access point. We query ontology, and we obtain 2 thread and 2 attacks. And we also obtain from the ontology that 5 security requirements, 5 security techniques and 3 security requirements are related to it. Now, for each of the submetrics, we obtain some scores. And I said before, we expect this process to be conducted by both global and local experts. Some of these scores may be predefined beforehand by global experts, while others may need to be obtained right on spot by local experts. For instance, the ones related to relevance, for exploitation relevance, and solution implementation. Those two are actually highlighted in gray. Those two should be actually obtained directly from the EDS infrastructure once risk analysis and methodology is actually being used. So we calculate all of these scores, and then we can create the tuples, and we can calculate the Excel score for each of these tuples. For instance, we have a subset of the many different tuples we can create. And here, the tuples contain a threat and attack, and these different requirements and security techniques. And as we can see in here, we have 4 tuples that are evaluated positively, and 2 of them have a negative score. With respect to the tuple labeled as number 3, we can see that based on this definition, the security technique number 5, which is network intrusion detection, is not good enough to implement the security requirement number 1, not unnecessary ports, which actually counteracts network backdoors and also counteract the possible threat of disgruntled employees. On the other hand, we also have a negative score. We for in the tuple number four, um, the security requirement number five. Once again, network intrusion detection, which is expected to implement requirement number three, enable only ports that are needed. It's also not implemented, no, it's not correctly. Okay, um, so now I'm gonna hand over to Wu, so who, and he's gonna be talking about our next tool, EDS guard.
Hello, everyone. My name is Boo, and I'll be talking about EDS Guard, enforcing security requirements for EDS networks. So, from the ontology and requirements that Carlos pulled from the ontology, we're gonna apply those using a firewall, and we're gonna use the firewall rules on EDS Guard. So we leverages on Toll EDS, EDS SAT, software defined network (SDN), and the state of the art of firewall policy management to improve the firewall requirements for EDS infrastructure. So security requirements. Um, so what EDS Guard can do is basically all of the firewall requirements that from the NIST paper, the IEC, and the cybersecurity procurement language document. So it can set the base rule, all denied at the beginning, protocol translation, and traffic restriction. So how is EDS Guard different from a traditional SDN firewall or a traditional firewall? So what EDS Guard can do is, um, first of all, the IT or the operator will push firewall rules at zero, and then at one, the firewall rules will be turned into the flow rules and will be installed on the switches. And then if the master POC sends a package to a slave POC, um, these firewall rule at the switches, the flow rule in the switches will either deny or allow the package to be sent. Um, and then if an attacker appears, the flow rule will also drop the package from the attacker. So potentially the firewall rule, the EDS guard can prevent internal spoofing attack. So the requirements example, traffic should be prevented from the control network to the culprit network. So going back to this diagram here, um, here we have the master POC and the slave POC in the diagram, but it could be two different subnets. So we can use the culprit network and the control network, for example. If we install the firewall rule to drop packages from these two networks, it will be installed on the switches and the package will be dropped. So we have the enforced within EDS guard, we have the enforced base authorization spaces. So anything that is in the authorizing space will be allowed to forward package to each other. If it's not, then it will drop the package. So here's the architecture of a flow guard or of EDS guard. Um, at zero, if a new flow is installed, for example, if an attacker shows up in the network, he or she will have to make a new flow, and this flow will be cross-check with the firewall rules at the controller, and whether or not if the firewall rule allows this attacker. Obviously, we don't want the attacker to be in the network, so the flow will be dropped. So then, therefore, the attacker will not be in the network in the first place. So at one, if an operator modifies a flow that caused a violation with the firewall rule, then EDS guard will use one of these resolution below, such as flow rejecting, dependency breaking, update rejecting, flow removing, or package blocking. So package blocking is used when you don't want to block the entire machine. You just want to block a service on the machine. So package blocking will be applied in that case. Otherwise, if the operator update the flow and the flow violates firewall policy, then the flow will be rejected. The update will be rejected. So for our test pass, we're using 3 different machines. So one is for display POC. It's MATLAB simulation with libmodbus library. A second machine is a master POC with the libmodbus library, and an attacker with the libmodbus library. We're using OpenALIKE for our controller, and we're using Open vSwitch for our switches. So here's a diagram for a MATLAB simulator. It representing a substation of the grid network. So for firewall rule, here's the format of our firewall rule. So we have a rule ID, which is unique name for the firewall rule. A no ID, which is the open flow switch appears on the controller. So you can have multiple switches, and it can be open flow 1, open flow 2, open flow 3, and so on. The import, which is the interface of the switch. So if host 1 is connected to open flow column 1, so that the last column 1 will be the import. Source and destination IP addresses, source and destination ports, and the action of the firewall. So as I mentioned before, here we have a flow update rejection case. If the firewall rule is configured and the firewall rule already turned into flow rules, and then an attacker or an operator tried to update this flow, and the operator accidentally update the flow such that the attacker can now attack one of the POCs, then EDS guard will detect the violation and either block the packet or just update the reject the update. So here we have a screenshot of how flow EDS guard in action. So EDS guard compute the path from one machine to another, and then the reverse path of it, and then decide whether or not that the different resolution is applied. So here we have a package blocking case. So a new firewall rule is configured to block the attacker, and EDS guard will take this rule and install it onto the switch. So now any packets coming from the attacker will be dropped at switch number 2. And here we have a flow diagram of the package blocking resolution. So when a firewall rule is configured, the controller will retrieve all flow from the switches, and the controller will cross-check the flow with the firewall rules for violation. If the violation is found, the controller will install a flow on the switch to drop the traffic. So as a screenshot, there's a before the resolution and after the resolution. So we have a quick demo um, for since our connection is not very stable, we can send out a link later on if anyone is interested on the demo. I will handing back to Carlo for the rest of the presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Boo. Um, well, just to finalize the presentation, um, this is a listing of our current and future work. With respect to onto EDS, we just got a paper accepted at the conference IEEE CIC. And with respect to Excel, we're working on refining the mathematical model as well as in a case study. One of the ideas we have with respect to this Excel framework is how to create reference scores such that for certain attacks or threats, we can determine if the score we are obtaining uh, is in a good shape or not. Perhaps these reference scores can be obtained from a case study and can certainly benefit from the input from experts within the CREDC and the rest of the EDS community. Finally, we expect to have a paper on Excel by the end of this fall 2017 semester. With respect to EDS Guard, we are working on the prototype and the experimental setup, as you just had a chance to see, as we just explained. And we also expect a paper to be ready by the end of this fall semester. Finally, with respect to the overall EDS framework, we published an introductory paper back in March in the context of the IEEE MS CPAS workshop. Um, we're also working on incorporating the aforementioned tools as models of this framework, and we expect to have a detailed paper by the end of the second quarter of 2018. This is pretty much it. We just want to thank all of you. Once again, we do apologize for the audio problems. We have here some contact information. If you want to go to our website, you want to contact me directly, or Boo or Josephine Lamb. And well, and now we are receiving your feedback.